Hello there, and welcome to my channel. I'm so glad you found your way here today. For nearly all the time our kind has existed, we were not alone. Other humans walked the same valleys, lit their own fires, and buried their own dead. They are gone now, every one of them, and yet they are not entirely absent. Fragments of them survive in our bones, in our reflexes, in the quiet code folded inside every cell you carry. Today we go looking for these shadow ancestors, the lost cousins and vanished lineages we left behind on the long road to becoming ourselves. Some we know from a single tooth, some we know only as ghosts in the DNA populations without a name or a face. What they left us is a story mostly unwritten, told in stone and marrow rather than words. And before we begin, if these calm explorations are something you enjoy, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way here too. Now let's begin. We move through the world assuming that human means only one thing, one shape, one kind of mind, one story. For almost all of our past, that was simply not the case. Picture a stretch of ancient coastline, where the people gathering shellfish do not all belong to the same kind, where a heavier-browed neighbor is not a stranger but another sort of human entirely. As recently as 40,000 years ago, our own species shared the planet with the Neanderthals of Europe and Western Asia, with the Denisovans farther east, with the small-statured people of the island of Flores, and very likely with others we have not yet found. Several kinds of human breathing, the same air, under the same moon, in the same slow centuries. The solitude we take for granted. The certainty that for the vast majority of the journey to be human was to be one voice among several, and the silence around us now is a recent thing. Your dentist calls them a problem. Evolution called them tools. Far at the back of the jaw sit the third molars, the ones we have learned to name wisdom teeth. And for most people today, they arrive crowded, crooked, or unable to surface at all. That trouble is recent. For millions of years, our ancestors chewed a coarse and gritty diet of raw plants, tough fibers, and unprocessed meat, food that wore teeth down and demanded a long, powerful row of grinders set in a broad and roomy jaw. Those extra molars were not spare parts. They were essential to a mouth built for heavy grinding work across a lifetime. Then, slowly, we changed what we ate. Cooking softened our food tools, cut and pounded it before it ever reached our teeth. And over many generations, the human jaw grew shorter while the number of teeth stayed the same. The result is a mismatch, written into your own skull, a full set of teeth pressed into a jaw no longer large enough to hold them. We often imagine our bodies as finished and well-designed, yet here is a place where we still carry equipment for a life we no longer live. A small daily reminder that we are shaped by ancestors whose meals we would barely recognize. There is a phrase that will not quite die the idea of a single missing link, one lost creature standing neatly between apes and us. The real picture is far more tangled and far more incomplete. Around 6 or 7 million years ago, our lineage and the lineage leading to chimpanzees parted ways from a shared ancestor. And from that early stretch of our story, we hold only a scattering of fragments, a piece of jaw here, a handful of teeth there, sometimes little more than a shard of skull. Between these fragments lie long silences the ground has not yet given back. If you have ever felt that the deep past should be a clear and finished map, know that even the people who study it live comfortably with open spaces in the story. There is no single link, only a thin, broken trail across an enormous span of time with far more lost than kept. Researchers still cannot say with confidence what many of those earliest ancestors looked like, or exactly how one gave rise to the next. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is an honest measure of how much of ourselves still waits underground, unread, patient holding pieces of a story we have only begun to recover. Step outside on a cold morning, or feel a chill move through you at a piece of music, and watch the skin of your arms tighten into tiny raised points. Have you ever wondered why fear or cold pulls the same strange response from your skin, a reaction you never chose and cannot stop? Each of those bumps sits at the base of a hair, and beneath it, lies a minute muscle called the erector pili. When it contracts, it tugs the hair upright and puckers the skin around it. In a furred animal, this is genuinely useful. Standing hair traps a warmer layer of air against the body in the cold, and a coat raised on end makes a frightened creature look suddenly larger to a rival or a predator. Our ancestors carried a far denser covering of hair, and this reflex served them exactly as it still serves a cat or a wolf. Then we lost most of that fur over a span of time. Researchers are still working to pin down, yet the wiring beneath the skin stayed behind. So the response remains faithfully lifting a coat that is no longer there. It is one of the clearest small proofs that your body remembers an animal you have never been, and answers for it still. Consider how little it can take to announce a whole kind of human. Not a skull, not a jaw, not a standing skeleton, but a sliver of bone smaller than a coffee bean. In a cave in the mountains of southern Siberia, researchers recovered the tip of a young girl's finger, and when they read the DNA inside it, the sequence matched neither us nor the Neanderthals. It belonged to a population no one had ever named a lineage that had branched off long before, and lived until then, entirely unsuspected. We call them the Denisovans, after the cave, and for years, that fingertip and a few teeth were nearly all we had of them. An entire branch of the human family, distinct enough to be its own kind, entered our knowledge through genetics, before we had a face to give it. Even now, the physical remains are painfully few scattered fragments from a handful of sites, so that much of what we know of these people is written not in fossils, but in the DNA they left inside living populations today. It is a strange inversion of the old way of knowing the past. Once, a species meant a skeleton in a museum drawer. Here was a people made real by chemistry alone, a lineage recognized from the faintest trace a body can leave. The ground still holds most of who they were, and we are only beginning to learn how to listen. Among mammals, human birth stands out for how hard and how dangerous it is, and the reason reaches back millions of years to the moment our ancestors rose onto two legs. Walking upright asked the pelvis to change. It narrowed and reshaped into a bowl that could carry the body's weight and drive an efficient stride. And that same reshaping tightened the very passage through which every child must pass. Then, much later, our brains began to grow, and infant heads grew with them. So the human body was left holding two demands that pull against each other: a birth canal kept narrow for walking, and a skull grown large for thinking. The compromise is the difficult, tightly fitted, often perilous birth that our species has known for as long as we have been ourselves. It is why human labor so often needs helping hands, and why we are nearly alone among animals in seeking one another out to give birth. We tend to think of standing upright as a simple gift the moment our hands came free, yet the same change quietly rewrote the most vulnerable passage of every human life. The way you entered the world was shaped by a bargain your earliest upright ancestors struck without any say in what it would cost, a tension carried forward in every generation since, unresolved and still with us. Ask most people what makes us human, and the answer comes quickly: the brain, the mind. We picture our ancestors growing clever first, then rising to walk as if to match their new intelligence. The fossils tell the opposite story. Our early relatives were walking upright on two legs for well over 3 million years, while their brains stayed close to the size of a chimpanzee's, no larger. Lucy and her kind strode across the African landscape on legs and hips, clearly built for walking, yet inside their skulls sat a brain that would not have hinted at anything remarkable. The great swelling of the human brain came far later, a recent chapter laid on top of a body that had already been upright for ages. The order we assume is reversed. First we stood and walked and freed our hands, and only long afterward did the mind we prize so highly begin to grow. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it unsettles a story we tell ourselves without noticing. We did not think our way onto 2 feet. We walked for 100,000 generations first, and the brain arrived late to a body that had already remade itself. Building the thinker upon a walker who had been waiting all along, the Neanderthals are gone, and have been gone for a very long time, yet a piece of them never quite left. This ancient lineage is sitting quietly inside a great many people at this very moment, folded into the genome, shaping bodies that have no memory of it. When the last Neanderthals died out around 40,000 years ago, that was not the end of their story. Because before they vanished, our own ancestors met them, lived beside them, and had children with them. The proof is chemical and precise. Most people whose ancestry lies outside Africa carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a small but real inheritance, threaded through the genome, and it is not scattered at random. Different people carry different surviving pieces, so that across a whole population, far more of the Neanderthal genome persists than any single person holds alone. These fragments are not idle. Some influence skin and hair, some the immune system, some the way the body handles cold or infection or sleep. A vanished kind of human extinct for 400 centuries still helps set the terms of how living bodies work. We speak of the Neanderthals as lost, and in every visible way they are, yet lost is not quite the right word, for something still being read cell by cell in the people walking the earth today. Some fossils are bone. This one is a moment. On an open plain in what is now Tanzania, a volcano coughed a layer of fine ash across the ground. Rain dampened it to the texture of wet cement, and across that surface before it hardened, several of our ancient relatives walked. Their feet left prints the ash set, and time sealed them. When researchers uncovered the trail at a site called Laetoli, they found not a single track, but several running, side by side for many meters, made by beings walking fully upright, almost 4 million years ago. The prints show a rounded heel, an arch, a big toe, aligned forward with the others, rather than splayed out like an ape's. This was a striding, two-legged walk, unmistakably like our own, pressed into the earth long before large brains, tools, or fire. What lingers is not the anatomy but the ordinariness of it. 2 or 3 individuals, perhaps a family, crossing a landscape together on an unremarkable day. One set of prints possibly following in the steps of another. We will never know where they were going or why. Yet there they are, a walk preserved for almost 4 million years closer to us in gait than we had any right to expect. Bones tell you what an ancestor was. These footprints tell you that an ancestor, on one particular morning, simply went somewhere, and that the going looked much like yours. Look closely at the inner corner of your eye near the nose, and you will find a small fold of pinkish tissue you have probably never once considered. It does almost nothing. Yet in many other animals, that same structure is a working third eyelid, a translucent membrane that sweeps sideways across the eye to clean and protect it while still letting the creature see. Birds use it, reptiles use it. A cat or a dog has one, and it flicks across the eye faster than you can follow. In us, it survives only as that little crescent in the corner, the plica semilunaris, reduced to a remnant with no function left. Somewhere along our lineage, the working membrane dwindled away, and what remains is the quiet leftover carried in every human face without purpose or notice. This shrunken fold is sitting in the corner of your eye as you read this, a piece of anatomy your ancestors used and you never will. There is something oddly intimate about it. We think of evolutionary leftovers as far away, buried in fossils abstract. This one is on your own face, visible in any mirror, a working part in a hawk and a faded echo in you. Proof that the body keeps its old drafts long after it has stopped using them. On the Indonesian island of Flores, in a cave called Liang Bua, researchers uncovered something that did not fit any expectation. The bones belonged to a human adult who stood little more than a meter tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, and yet lived alongside stone tools and the remains of hunted animals. This was not a child, and not a diseased individual, but a member of a distinct human species now called Homo floresiensis, small in body and small in brain, surviving on its island for a very long stretch of time. What unsettles most is how recent they were. These tiny people persisted until perhaps 50,000 years ago, meaning our own species. And this miniature cousin very likely shared the same world, even the same region, within a span that feels almost close enough to touch. Think for a moment about the last time you assumed the deep past was safely distant, and unlike our own world, here is a human being, a meter-tall hunting with tools alive, while our ancestors were already spreading across the earth. How they came to be so small and how they lasted so long remains genuinely unsettled among the people who study them. What is not in doubt is that being human, even in the recent past, came in more shapes than the one we see in the mirror, and that the family was far stranger and more crowded than the lonely present suggests. There is a woman to whom every living human is related through an unbroken line of mothers, and researchers have given her a name that sounds almost mythic. They call her mitochondrial Eve. The name misleads though, because she was not the first woman, not the only woman, and certainly not alone. She lived in Africa somewhere around 1 to 200,000 years ago, as one member of a thriving population of people surrounded by others whose maternal lines simply happened over the long run of chance to die out. Her line did not. Follow your mother's mother's mother back far enough, and everyone alive converges on her. Because mitochondrial DNA passes down almost unchanged from mother to child, tracing a single thread through the generations. She is real, and she is ours in common, yet she was thoroughly ordinary in her own day, one woman among many, with no idea that her particular thread would be the one to reach across every continent and every person now breathing. It is a humbling kind of kinship. Whatever divides people now, language, distance, the look of a face, all of it traces back through the dark to the same African mother and to the crowd of forgotten women who lived and loved beside her, but whose lines quietly came to an end. Deep beneath the ground in South Africa lies a chamber so hard to reach that entering it means crawling through passages barely wider than a body squeezing down a chute in total darkness. Inside, researchers found bones, many bones belonging to a human relative unknown. Until then, a species now called Homo naledi. It had a brain roughly a third the size of ours, a mix of ancient and modern features, and it lived more recently than such a small-brained creature had any business doing. But the deeper puzzle is the chamber itself. There are no signs the bodies were dragged in by predators, no evidence of flooding that could have washed them there. The remains of many individuals, young and old, lie in a place that could only be reached with great difficulty, and quite possibly with light. That has led some researchers to a startling and still contested idea that these small-brained beings deliberately carried their dead into the dark. If that is true, it means a behavior we thought required a large brain and a mind like ours appeared in a cousin whose head was closer to an ape's. The claim is fiercely debated, and honest researchers admit they cannot yet be sure. What is certain is that the old comfortable link between big brains and the care of the dead has been shaken. Somewhere in that black chamber sits a question we have not answered about who is capable of grief and how far back the impulse to honor the dead may truly reach. Some people can wiggle their ears, a party trick, faintly comic, entirely useless. That uselessness is the point. Around each human ear sit three small muscles, the same set that in many mammals swivels the outer ear toward a sound, letting the animal pinpoint a rustle in the grass or a footstep behind it without turning its head. A cat or a horse aims its ears like small radar dishes, drawing in the direction of danger. Our ancestors deeper in the past could very likely do something similar, orienting the ear toward a noise that might mean a predator or prey. We still carry those muscles wired and ready sitting against your skull right now, but for most people the connection has faded until the ears barely move at all. The wiggle a few people manage is the last flicker of a system that once helped keep an animal alive. Researchers have even found that when a sudden sound catches your attention, faint electrical signals still fire in those ear muscles, a ghost of the old reflex trying to turn an ear that no longer turns. It is a small, almost tender absurdity of the body, a muscle that survives its own purpose. Your ears cannot chase a sound the way a deer's can, yet the machinery to try is still there, quietly attempting a movement your ancestors mastered and you have almost entirely lost. Not every ancestor left a body we can find. Some left only a signature in the DNA of the living, a statistical shadow with no fossil attached, and researchers have a name for such a thing. They call it a ghost lineage. In the genomes of certain populations in West and Central Africa, geneticists have detected stretches of ancient DNA that do not match modern humans, do not match Neanderthals, and do not match Denisovans. The pattern points to interbreeding long ago with a population that branched off deep in the past, and yet we have never uncovered a single bone we can confidently assign to it. It exists for us only as an echo in the code, an ancestor known purely by the trace it left inside people alive today. This ancient presence is threaded quietly through living bodies at this very moment, an unnamed people speaking through a genome that outlived every bone they ever had. It is a humbling reminder of how partial our picture remains. The African fossil record is thin in exactly the places and times that matter most, so it is entirely possible that whole populations of ancient humans lived, mingled with our ancestors, and vanished without leaving anything for us to dig up. We know they were there only because a fragment of them refused to disappear, carried forward in the one archive that never stopped recording. On a hot day, a human is a poor sprinter. A gazelle, a horse, a hare, nearly anything with 4 legs will leave us behind in a short dash. Yet stretch the distance, and the contest quietly reverses. Few animals on Earth can run for hours the way a fit human can, and that endurance is written all through the body. We have long, spring-like tendons in the legs, a tall, narrow build that sheds heat, and above all the ability to sweat across bare skin, cooling ourselves while we move. A 4-legged runner cannot pant and gallop at full stretch for long, so on a hot enough day, it must eventually stop to shed heat, and a human who keeps moving can close the gap. Some researchers believe our ancestors used exactly this, following an animal across the open ground at a steady pace, never fast enough to catch it in a burst, simply refusing to stop until the prey overheated and could run no more. The next time your legs ache toward the end of a long walk or run, consider that the discomfort sits on top of one of the oldest talents our lineage owns. We did not become the fastest animal. We became the one that would not quit, and the body that carries you through a long, tiring day was shaped by ancestors who won their meals not with speed, but with the refusal to stop. Understood. I'll loosen my grip on the machinery, let the connections land where they naturally want to rather than counting them out. Vary the shapes more freely, and trust the meaning to carry the rhythm instead of hitting marks. The framework stays underneath, but I'll write it like someone talking, not assembling. We tend to measure success in cleverness, and by that measure, we flatter ourselves. But consider Homo erectus, an ancestor with a smaller brain, a heavier brow, none of our art or writing or cities. This was the human that first tamed fire, first walked out of Africa and spread across half the world, first carried its life on 2 long striding legs built almost exactly like ours. And it lasted. Homo erectus endured for something close to 1.5 million years, walking the earth across a span so vast that our own species, all 200,000 or 300,000 years of us, looks brief and untested by comparison. Think of everything that has happened in recorded human history, every empire, every invention, every war and song, and understand that it fits many times over inside the lifetime of that one earlier human. They were not building toward us. They were simply living, generation after generation, longer than we have yet managed to survive. It is a quiet correction to our pride. We assume that intelligence is what keeps a species alive, that being the cleverest makes us the most secure. Erectus suggests otherwise. A modest brain and a good body carried a kind of human across an ocean of time we have not come close to crossing, and whether we will ever match that endurance is a question the future, not the past, will answer. Look into another person's eyes, and you can tell almost instantly where they are looking. That sounds too obvious to be remarkable, until you notice that most other primates cannot offer you the same. A chimpanzee's eye is largely dark, the colored iris blending into surrounding tissue so the direction of its gaze stays hidden. Ours are different. We alone among primates have a broad, bright white sclera framing the iris, and against that pale background, the dark center stands out like a pointer, broadcasting exactly where our attention has gone. The leading idea for why is disarmingly social. A hidden gaze is useful to a competitor, letting an animal watch and stalk without giving itself away. But a visible gaze is useful to a cooperator, letting a companion follow your eyes to a threat, a meal, a thing worth sharing without a single word. Somewhere in our past, the balance apparently tipped toward showing rather than hiding, toward being read by our own kind. It is a strange and touching thought that the openness of the human eye may be a mark of how deeply we came to depend on one another. Before we had language, we could still direct a friend's attention with nothing but a glance, and the plain, visible whites of your eyes, which you never think about, may be evidence that trust was built into us long before words were. There is a place in northern Spain, deep in a cave system, that carries a name meaning the pit of bones. At the bottom of a long vertical shaft, researchers have recovered the remains of dozens of ancient humans, thousands of bones from many individuals, all gathered in a single spot roughly 400,000 years ago. These were not our species, but earlier humans, ancestors or close relatives of the Neanderthals, and the puzzle is how they all came to rest together at the base of that shaft. There is little sign that they simply fell or were dragged there by animals over the ages. One quiet possibility, argued carefully and still debated, is that the living carried their dead to this place and let them down into the dark deliberately, again and again across many years. If that is what happened, it pushes the roots of some funerary impulse back much further than we once dared to claim, into a kind of human very unlike us. Among the bones lies a single beautiful hand axe out of place, which some have wondered might be an offering. We cannot be sure, and the people who study this site are honest about that. But standing at the edge of that pit, it becomes hard to hold on to the idea that reverence for the dead is a recent or exclusively modern thing. Something in us that gathers and keeps its dead may be very old indeed. Run a finger along your own jaw to the front, and you will find something no other animal possesses. Not a large jaw, not a strong one, but a chin, that small, forward projection of bone at the very front of the lower jaw. It sounds trivial, and it is anything but settled. No other primate has it. Neanderthals, with all their strength, did not have it. Even our own close ancestors lack a true chin. And then in modern humans, there it is, a distinct bony point present in every one of us and in no one else alive. The strange part is that after decades of study, researchers still cannot agree on why. Some have argued it braces the jaw against the forces of chewing, though the mechanics do not fully convince. Others suspect it is a side effect of the human face, shrinking and folding as our jaws grew smaller, the chin left behind like a shoreline after the tide draws back. A few wonder whether it played some role in speech or was simply shaped by chance and sexual selection. The honest answer is that we do not know. It is a small, humbling fact that a feature on your own face, one of the few things unique to our entire species, remains a genuine, open question. You carry a small mystery at the front of your jaw, and no one has yet fully explained why it is there. Take most people to the high plateaus of Tibet, 3,000 or 4,000 meters up, and their bodies strain. The blood thickens with extra red cells to catch the thin air. and that thickening brings its own dangers over time. Yet the people who have lived on that roof of the world for generations do something different. They breathe easily where others falter, their blood staying safer and thinner while still carrying enough oxygen to thrive. For a long time, this was simply a marvel of adaptation. Then the genetics arrived, and the story turned strange. The key gene behind this high-altitude ESA variant called EPAS1 was traced back to an unexpected source. It came from the Denisovans, that ghostly cousin known mostly from a fingertip in a Siberian cave. Somewhere in the deep past, ancestors of today's Tibetans interbred with Denisovans, and one of those ancient people happened to carry a version of this gene, suited to thin air. It was passed down, favored, and eventually spread through a whole population, living higher than almost anyone else on Earth. So a people flourishing on the highest inhabited ground alive today do so partly on a gift from a vanished kind of human. The Denisovans left almost no bones, and yet with every unstrained breath, a Tibetan mountaineer takes a fragment of them, is still doing its quiet work, keeping a body alive in a place that would punish the rest of us. Here is something most people never question. A glass of milk seems like one of the most natural things a human could drink. For nearly all of our history, it was not. Milk is for infants, and across the animal kingdom, the body switches off the enzyme that digests milk sugar once a young mammal is weaned. Our ancestors were no exception. For hundreds of thousands of years, every adult human alive would have found fresh milk hard to stomach because the machinery to break it down simply shut off in childhood, as it still does for much of the world today. Then something recent and remarkable happened. After people began herding animals a few thousand years ago, a genetic change appeared that kept the milk-digesting enzymes switched on into adulthood. In places where dairy meant survival through hard seasons, that change spread with startling speed, so that today whole populations drink milk comfortably their whole lives, while others whose ancestors kept no herds still cannot. What you can or cannot digest at breakfast is not an accident of your individual body, but a record of what your ancestors did a few thousand years ago. It is evolution caught almost in the act, close enough to touch a rewriting of the human body that happened not in some unreachable deep time, but well within the span of farming villages and the first written words. We like to imagine the Neanderthals as the lesser draft of humanity, slower, dimmer, a brutish rehearsal before the real thing arrived. The skulls say something more troubling. Measure the space inside a Neanderthal brain case, and you find a brain fully as large as our own, and often a little larger. Whatever separated us from them raw brain size was not it. These were not dull creatures. They made fine tools, controlled fire-hunted, large and dangerous animals in coordinated groups, used plants for medicine, and buried at least some of their dead. Their brains were simply shaped a little differently from ours, longer and lower, where ours is rounder and higher, with differences in the regions behind the eyes and toward the back of the skull. Researchers still debate what those differences meant for how they thought, and the honest position is that we cannot fully read a mind from the shape of the skull that held it. What we can say is that the comfortable story, the one where a bigger brain made us the winners and them the losers, does not survive contact with the evidence. They matched us in the one measure we most wanted to claim, and still they are gone and we remain. Why that happened is one of the genuinely open questions of our past, and the size of the brain, the thing we were so sure explained everything, explains almost nothing here at all. A hiccup is one of the body's small indignities, sudden, involuntary, faintly ridiculous, and utterly pointless as far as anyone can tell. It does nothing useful for you now, but its very uselessness has led some researchers to look far back for its origin, and the trail may run astonishingly deep. A hiccup is a sharp intake of breath cut short by a snap of the throat closing, and that particular pairing, a gulp followed by a quick sealing off, closely resembles the way certain water-dwelling animals move water across their gills. Some scientists have proposed that the hiccup reflex is a leftover of the neural circuitry once used for that gulping, breathing motion inherited from creatures on the long path between fish and land animals. Still wired into the same region of our own nervous system, the idea remains a proposal argued rather than proven, and it is worth being clear about that. But the shape of the reflex, the way it seizes the same ancient muscles in the same ancient pattern, is suggestive enough to take seriously. The next time a fit of hiccups catches you off guard, there is a real chance you are watching a piece of very old machinery misfire, a rhythm that made sense in water and lingers purposeless in a body that left the water behind an unfathomably long time ago. Just when the family tree seemed crowded enough, the ground offered another branch. In Callao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, researchers recovered a small collection of teeth and bones, a few finger and toe bones, part of a thigh. Modest remains easy to overlook, but the anatomy would not sit quietly in any known species. The teeth were curiously small and simple. The finger and toe bones curved in a way that hinted at climbing a mix of ancient and more modern traits that matched nothing on record. In 2019, the researchers announced a new human species, Homo luzonensis, known so far from almost nothing at all. That it existed is remarkable. That it existed on a remote island, reachable only across open sea, is stranger still, because it means some ancestor made a water crossing long ago and then in isolation went its own evolutionary way. How they arrived, how they lived, when exactly they vanished, all of it remains largely blank. This is how much of our story still comes to us, not in complete skeletons, but in a handful of bones that quietly refuse to belong anywhere we already know. Each such find widens the family and deepens the mystery at once, a reminder that the count of humankinds is not settled history, but an open ledger, still gaining names from caves we have only just begun to search. Everyone with blue eyes today may share a single ancestor, one person in whom a small change first appeared. That sounds like a story too neat to be true, and yet the genetics point firmly toward it. Blue is not a pigment in the eye. There is no blue coloring at all. The iris simply lacks the brown pigment that would otherwise fill it, and the light scattering through the tissue reads as blue. The same trick that makes a clear sky look blue over an atmosphere that holds no blue paint. That reduction in pigment traces to a single alteration near a particular gene, a change that dims the production of brown in the iris. Because the same alteration turns up in blue-eyed people across many populations, geneticists concluded it most likely arose once in one individual, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, and spread from there. So every blue-eyed person alive may be in this narrow sense distant kin, all carrying the trace of one ancestor who happened to be born a little different. It is a small and human-scale marvel folded into something we see every day. A stranger's blue eyes are not just a color, but a shared inheritance. A genetic echo of a single unknown person from a few thousand years ago, quietly repeated across millions of faces who will never know they are in this one respect related. We call ourselves the toolmaker Homo, the handy one, as though tools and our kind arrived together. The stones say otherwise. In Kenya, at a site by an ancient lake, researchers have found stone tools deliberately struck into sharp edges around 3.3 million years ago, older than the first fossils we can confidently assign to our own genus Homo. Someone was making and using tools before there was anyone we would comfortably call one of us. The likely toolmakers were earlier, smaller-brained relatives, ancestors or cousins, whose hands had already learned to break a stone into something useful to cut and scrape and process food, long before the arrival of the large-brained humans we imagine as the natural inventors. It quietly overturns the order we assumed. We did not become clever and then pick up tools. The tools were already in ancestral hands, and the mind we prize may have grown in part because of what those hands were already doing. Skill came before the swollen brain, not after it. Somewhere, On an African lakeshore, more than 3 million years ago, a hand closed around a stone and struck it just so, and the being holding it was not yet what we would call human, and yet was already doing the most human thing of all. Think of your DNA as entirely purely human, the master text of what you are. It is nothing so clean. A striking fraction of the human genome, something on the order of 8%, is not human in origin at all. It is viral. Across many millions of years, viruses of a particular kind infected the cells of our ancestors and inserted their own genetic code into the DNA of egg and sperm. And when that happens in the cells that make the next generation, the intruding code is copied forward forever. Do it again and again over deep time, virus after virus. And the fragments accumulate until nearly 1/12 of the genome you carry is the fossilized wreckage of ancient infections, sitting silently in every cell of your body at this very moment. Most of it is broken and dormant now, mere debris. But not all. Our ancestors did something extraordinary with a little of it. A gene borrowed from one of these ancient viruses became essential to building the placenta, the organ that lets a mammal nourish its young in the womb. So a piece of viral code, hijacked in the deep past, helped make possible the very way you were carried and fed before birth. The line between us and the things that once infected us turns out to be far blurrier than we would like, written permanently into the book of what we are. A shell with a hole in it does not sound like much, but it may be one of the earliest signs of a mind working the way yours does. In caves across North Africa and the Near East, researchers have found small seashells, each pierced through in the same spot, some still bearing traces of red pigment dating back more than 100,000 years. These were not food. The shells came from species too small to eat, carried far inland from the coast, deliberately perforated so they could be strung and worn. In other words, they were beads ornaments, and someone chose to make and wear them long before farming cities or writing. That matters more than it first appears. To wear an ornament is to care how you are seen, to send a signal about who you are to others who can read it, to hold in mind a self that exists in the eyes of other people. It is thought reaching past the immediate needs of the body, past food and shelter and safety, into meaning. When you choose what to wear tomorrow morning, even without a moment's reflection, you are doing something a human was already doing 100,000 years ago on a distant shore. The impulse to adorn, to mark ourselves as someone, turns out to be very old, older than almost everything we think of as civilization, quietly stitched into us long before we had any words to explain it. Place a finger against the palm of a newborn baby, and the small hand closes around it with a grip so firm it can astonishingly nearly bear the infant's own weight. New parents feel it and marvel. That strength in a creature otherwise so helpless seems almost out of place, and its origin lies far behind us. It is called the palmar grasp reflex, present from birth, and it fades over the first months of life. In the young of other primates, it is not a curiosity but a necessity, because an infant monkey or ape must cling to its mother's fur as she moves and climbs, holding on through her hair with exactly this reflexive grip while her hands stay free. Our babies are born with the same wiring, the same automatic clutch, inherited from ancestors whose infants also clung to a furred body for safety. We lost the fur. The reflex stayed. So a human newborn arrives, still equipped to grasp a coat of hair that its mother no longer has, gripping the air or a finger with an ancient urgency meant for holding fast to a body in motion. There is something quietly moving in it. The very first thing a human does in the world, before it can see clearly or hold up its own head, is perform a gesture handed down from ancestors who lived in trees, reaching for a hold that vanished long ago and clinging anyway. We have already met them one by one. Now hold them all in mind together. Roughly 50,000 years ago, and for a long stretch around that time, the Earth was home to several kinds of human at once. Our own species was spreading out of Africa. The Neanderthals held Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans ranged somewhere across the vast East. The small-statured people of Flores hunted on their island, and the newly found Luzon people had their own remote corner, and there may well have been others still hidden from us. 4, 5, perhaps more kinds of human alive in overlapping centuries, some of them meeting, some of them mingling, most of them never knowing the others existed. Sit with how ordinary that once was and how utterly strange it would feel now. To be human today is to look around and see only variations of one single kind, one species alone on the whole planet. For most of the deep past, that was not the human condition at all. The world held a scattering of different humans, the way it holds different kinds of bear or big cat, and then one by one, every branch but ours went quiet. We are not the natural and inevitable state of things. We are the single surviving twig of what was once a spreading many-branched bush, and the loneliness of that is easy to miss precisely because it is all we have ever known. A baby arrives, covered in something unexpected, a soft white waxy coating spread across the skin, and new parents are often surprised by it. It has a name, Vernix caseosa, and for a long time it seemed like little more than a mess to be wiped away. It is far older and more purposeful than that. This waxy layer forms in the womb during the final stretch before birth, waterproofing the infant's skin against the surrounding fluid, guarding it from becoming waterlogged and cracked, and easing the passage into the world. Remarkably, human beings appear to be almost the only species that produces it in this way, though the deeper machinery behind it reaches back into our shared mammalian past, connected to the same biology that once helped protect the delicate skin of young animals developing in fluid. The infant you once were came into the world, wrapped in a protection, worked out over an immense span of evolutionary time, a coating whose job was quietly finished the moment you drew your first breath. It is easy to forget that even the very newest human minutes old arrives already carrying the deep past on its skin. Before a baby has a name, before it has opened its eyes on anything, it wears an inheritance older than our species, a thin, protective layer perfected by ancestors for a life spent at its very beginning submerged. There is a famous Neanderthal skeleton, an old man by the standards of his world, whose bones tell a story that is hard to read without feeling something. He was severely disabled. One arm was withered and likely useless. He was blind in one eye. He suffered a crippling injury to the leg, and he had lost most of his teeth. And yet he lived for years in that broken condition, well into what was, for a Neanderthal, old age. A person that impaired could not have survived alone in an Ice Age landscape. Someone fed him, someone kept him warm, moved with his pace, chose not to leave him behind when it would have been far easier to do so. Across several Neanderthal sites, this same pattern appears: individuals who lived long past crippling injuries, and bodies that seem to have been deliberately placed in graves rather than abandoned. This complicates every clean line we have tried to draw between them and us. We wanted the Neanderthals to be the others, the lesser kind, so that our own survival would feel earned and inevitable. But a species that cares for its helpless and lays its dead to rest is difficult to hold at arm's length. In that cared-for old man, broken and kept alive by the hands of his people, we are looking at something we would recognize instantly in ourselves, and did not expect to find in a kind of human we outlasted. We touched on this once, and it deserves a fact of its own, because it may be the strangest debt the body owes. The placenta is the organ that makes us what we are, a creature nourished inside its mother, rather than in an egg. And at the heart of how it forms is a protein called syncytin. Syncytin lets certain cells fuse together into the boundary layer that lets nutrients pass from mother to child, while keeping their two bodies distinct. It is essential. Without it, That connection cannot properly form. And the gene for syncytin did not arise from our own ancestral biology at all. It was captured from a virus hundreds of millions of years ago in the deep ancestry of mammals. Viruses of this kind naturally make proteins to fuse cells together so they can spread, and at some ancient point, that viral tool was hijacked, domesticated, and turned to an entirely new purpose, building the very organ that lets a mammal carry its young within. Pause on what that means. The intimate biology of pregnancy, the way you were joined to and separated from your mother before birth, rests on a fragment of ancient infection that our lineage stole and made its own. What began as an invader became indispensable. We are in a small but literal way, built partly from the things that once tried to use us, the line between self and other, written over so long ago that we could not build a human without it. The tiny people of Flores are strange enough on their own. Then the island offered a second puzzle beneath the first. Long before anyone found the meter-tall Homo floresiensis, and in older layers of Earth, researchers uncovered stone tools on Flores, dating back around 1 million years, far earlier than the little people whose bones we later recovered. Someone was on that island making tools, hundreds of thousands of years before the small humans we know from the cave. And Flores has been an island cut off by deep water for an immensely long time, never joined to the mainland by any land bridge crossable on foot. To reach it, an ancient human had to cross open sea. That single fact reshapes what we thought early humans could do. A seafaring crossing, deliberate or accidental, by a small-brained ancestor 1 million years ago, is not something the textbooks prepared us for. Who exactly those first toolmakers were, whether they were the ancestors of the tiny people or an even earlier group, and how they managed the water remains genuinely unresolved. What the tools quietly insist is that humans were reaching places and doing things far earlier and far more daringly than our tidy picture allowed. The island keeps two mysteries stacked, one atop the other, and we have only truly begun to reckon with the deeper one. At the very base of your spine sits a small fused knot of bone called the coccyx, the tailbone, easy to forget, until you land hard on it. It is the end of your spine, and it is also the end of a tail. Early in development, a human embryo grows a genuine tail, a slender projection with a number of small vertebrae, clearly visible for a brief window a few weeks after conception. Then the body does something remarkable. It reabsorbs it. The tail is dismantled and largely reclaimed, and what remains fuses into that little stub of bone you carry for the rest of your life. Every human being passes through this stage, growing and then losing a tail before ever being born, a swift replay of a distant ancestor who wore its tail openly. The tailbone that anchors muscles in your pelvis today is the quiet leftover of that vanished appendage. It is worth letting that settle for a moment. Before you had a face, before your fingers had separated, you briefly had a tail and your body chose to take it back. We carry the record of our animal past not only in dusty fossils, but in the very way we are assembled in the womb. Each of us rehearsing, and then quietly editing out a piece of a creature we descend from, keeping only the small bone that remembers it. The Denisovans are known to us mainly from a single cave in the mountains of Siberia, so you might expect their genetic trace to be strongest in the people living nearest to it. It is the opposite. The heaviest surviving Denisovan inheritance today is found thousands of kilometers away, among the peoples of New Guinea, Australia, and the islands scattered between them, where some individuals carry several % of their DNA from this vanished cousin. That distribution tells a story the bones alone never could. It means the Denisovans were not confined to one cold Siberian corner, but ranged far to the south and east, through warm and tropical lands where their bones have almost entirely rotted away in the humid soil, leaving little for us to find. We know they were there, mainly because their DNA persists in the living, mapped across a region where we have scarcely a fragment of their actual remains. A whole geography of a lost people reconstructed from the genomes of their distant descendants, rather than from anything they physically left behind. It is a reminder of how much the deep past depends on chance, on which soils preserve bone and which devour it. The Denisovans may have been widespread and successful across half a continent, and the near silence of their fossil record reflects not their rarity, but the simple fact that the warm earth kept almost nothing while the code they passed on refused to be erased. In a cave on the South African coast, researchers found a small piece of red ochre, a soft iron-rich stone, and on one smoothed face of it, someone had scratched a deliberate pattern, a set of cross-hatched lines forming a rough grid made. Roughly 70,000 years ago. It is not a picture of anything. It represents no animal, no scene, no obvious object. And that is exactly what makes it haunting. Those lines were cut on purpose, arranged with evident intent by a human hand tens of thousands of years before writing, before farming, before anything we would call art in the familiar sense. What did it mean? A design for its own sake, a mark of ownership, a count of something, a symbol whose meaning died with its maker. We truly do not know. What the engraving proves is that the mind behind it could hold an abstract pattern and choose to render it, could make a mark that stood for the act of marking rather than for a thing in the world. That capacity to create a symbol sits close to the root of everything we later built with language and number and story. Somewhere on that ancient coast, a person paused and cut lines into red stone for a reason we will never recover, and in that small, deliberate gesture, we glimpse the beginning of a mind that would eventually learn to write down everything it thought. Every gift extracts a price, and the human voice extracts a dangerous one. Our ability to speak with such precision depends on the unusual shape of the human throat, in particular a voice box that sits low in the neck, far lower than in other primates. That low larynx opens up a long resonant chamber above it, letting us shape an extraordinary range of sounds. The fine distinctions of vowels and consonants on which all speech depends, but it comes with a hidden cost that can kill. Because our airway and our food passage cross paths in that same lowered region of the throat, the human design leaves food and drink able to slip into the airway far more easily than in most animals. We are uniquely among creatures, seriously prone to choking on our own meals, a risk woven into the same anatomy that gave us speech. It is a bargain of exactly the kind evolution so often strikes an extraordinary new ability, bought at the price of a real and permanent danger. Every time you eat while talking and something goes down wrong, you are feeling the edge of that trade. The throat that lets you say anything at all is built in a way that can, on a bad day, let a swallow of water end you, and we carry that vulnerability, because the power of speech was across the long run worth the risk it brought. Step back and take in the whole shape of what we have been circling. For all of recorded history, and for a good stretch before it, there has been only one kind of human on Earth: us. So completely alone that the idea of another human species feels like fantasy, something for stories rather than fact. And yet on the timescale of our lineage, this solitude is a very recent development, and a genuinely odd one. For millions of years, there were always several kinds of human sharing the world, overlapping, sometimes meeting each, going its own way. Then, within roughly the last 40,000 years, every branch but ours fell silent, until only a single kind remained, to look around and find no one like itself. Take a moment to feel how unusual our situation truly is, against the long backdrop of the past. We are the first humans in the whole of that history to be utterly alone. We tend to treat our solitude as the natural order, the obvious way things must be. It is nothing of the kind. It is the recent and slightly eerie outcome of a long winnowing in which a once crowded family narrowed to one, whatever caused the others to disappear, and much of that remains uncertain. The result is a species that has forgotten it ever had company, mistaking a brief and unusual loneliness for the permanent condition of being human. Generations of students were taught that the appendix is a useless relic, a shriveled dead end left over from a plant-eating past, good for nothing but occasionally becoming inflamed and needing to be cut out. That confident dismissal now looks premature. The appendix is a small pouch branching off the large intestine, and while it plays no role in digestion, researchers have gathered evidence for a quieter and more interesting job. It appears to serve as a kind of safe house for the beneficial bacteria that live in our gut. When a severe illness floods the intestines and sweeps that helpful microbial community out, the appendix, tucked off to the side and rich in immune tissue, may hold a reserve population that can move back in and repopulate the gut once the crisis passes. In a world before modern medicine, where a bad bout of illness could strip the digestive system bare, that reservoir could have made a real difference to survival. It is a useful correction to our habit of calling anything we do not understand useless. The organ we were so sure was pointless may have been doing patient unnoticed work all along, and the older story in which the appendix is merely evolutionary junk may have said more about the limits of our knowledge than about the thing itself. The body keeps some of its purposes well hidden, and we're slow sometimes to notice them. We think of humanity as a vast and unstoppable tide, billions strong, spread across every continent. There may have been a time when the whole future of our lineage hung on a frighteningly thin thread. Written into the genetics of living people are the traces of what researchers call bottlenecks. Moments in the past when the breeding population of our ancestors appears to have collapsed to a very small number, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, or in one contested reconstruction, far fewer still. A population that small is desperately fragile. A few bad seasons, a disease, a shift in climate, and the entire line could have ended quietly, with no one left to carry it forward. The narrowness shows up in our DNA as a striking lack of genetic diversity compared to many other species, a sign that all of us descend from a small pool of survivors who passed through some hard and narrow passage of the past. The details are debated, the exact numbers and dates still argued over, but the broad signal is real and it is sobering. Every person alive is descended from ancestors who came within sight of vanishing entirely, who survived when survival was anything but assured. The teeming billions of today rest on a foundation that was once, for a time, almost nothing at all, a handful of people holding the whole thread of our existence in their hands without knowing it. Picture a Neanderthal, and you may imagine pale skin and perhaps a shock of red hair suited to the dim northern light of Ice Age Europe. The evidence suggests some of them did look that way, but here is the twist that makes it interesting. When researchers examined the genes behind pale skin and red hair in Neanderthals, they found that the specific genetic changes producing that appearance were different from the ones that give pale skin and red hair to living humans today. Both kinds of human arrived at a similar look but by separate genetic routes, each independently. This is evolution solving the same problem twice, in two different lineages, with two different answers that happen to land in the same place. In the weak sunlight of the north, lighter skin helps the body make enough vitamin D, so both Neanderthals and the modern humans who later moved into those latitudes were nudged toward paler coloring, arriving there through their own separate mutations. It quietly undoes a lazy assumption that a shared trait must mean a shared origin. Two kinds of human can look alike for the same underlying reason, the same environmental pressure, and yet carry entirely different instructions beneath the surface. The pale red-haired Neanderthal was not borrowing our genes or lending us theirs. It was walking a parallel path to a similar face, shaped by the same cold northern sun that would later shape ours. Hold your hand up and touch the tip of your thumb to the tip of your little finger. That small, effortless motion is one of the quiet triumphs of our lineage. The human hand possesses a thumb that is long, strong, and mobile relative to the fingers, able to swing across and press firmly against each fingertip in what is called a precision grip. It is what lets you thread a needle, turn a key, hold a pen grip, a small tool with control, Other primates have opposable thumbs, but ours is distinctly reshaped, the muscles and proportions refined over millions of years toward exactly this fine, forceful, precise handling of objects. The archaeological record traces the change, alongside the making of ever more refined stone tools. Hand and tool, apparently shaping each other across deep time. Each new demand on the grip favoring the hands best suited to meet it. Consider how much of your day passes through that grip, without a single thought. Every object you pick up and manipulate, resting on an anatomy perfected long before you were born. The hand you use to do the most ordinary things, to button a shirt or lift a cup, is the inherited result of an immense stretch of evolutionary refinement, a tool for using tools handed down from ancestors whose survival slowly, steadily sharpened the very grip you are using right now. We have grown used to the idea that our ancestors mingled with the Neanderthals. Here is the deeper turn. The Neanderthals had their own shadow ancestors too. When researchers read the full Neanderthal genome closely, they found stretches within it that did not fit, segments of DNA pointing to interbreeding with a still older, unidentified human population. A lineage that had branched away long before and left its mark inside the Neanderthals, just as the Neanderthals later left their mark inside us. So the mingling of humankinds was not a single event at the end of the story. It reaches back and back, layer beneath layer, ancestors, interbreeding with more ancient ancestors. Ghosts inside ghosts. The Neanderthals themselves carried the genetic echo of a people we have never identified and may never find, folded into their DNA long before they ever met our line. It is a humbling picture of the family tree, if a tree is even the right word for it. Rather than a clean set of separating branches, the deep human past looks more like a web, kinds of human repeatedly meeting and mixing across an immense span of time, each carrying fragments of others inside them. We inherited pieces of the Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals had already inherited pieces of someone older still, so that what we carry is not a single lost cousin, but a nested inheritance of the vanished reaching further back than we can yet see. It is worth being honest about how little we actually have. We speak of the human story as though it were a filled-in narrative, but for enormous stretches of our ancestry, the physical evidence amounts to almost nothing. An entire ancient species may be known from a single jawbone. Millions of years of a lineage may rest on a scatter of teeth, a piece of skull, a few bones from one or two individuals, and sometimes there are long silences, from which we have recovered nothing at all. Bone survives only under rare and lucky conditions, when the ground is just right to preserve it, and erosion later brings it back into the light, at the moment someone is there to see. The vast majority of the humans who ever lived left no trace we will ever hold. This is not a failure to be embarrassed about, but the honest shape of the field and the people who study it live comfortably with these gaps. The story we tell is stitched together from fragments, with long dark spaces between them, that we fill provisionally with careful reasoning and the expectation of more discoveries to come. When you picture the parade of human ancestors, remember that most of it is missing, and that what we know is a scattering of lit windows in a very long, mostly darkened corridor, with far more waiting in the dark than has ever been brought into the light. Off the coasts of Southeast Asia live people known as the Bajau, sometimes called sea nomads, who spend much of their lives on the water and dive to remarkable depths on a single breath to gather food from the sea floor. They can stay under far longer than most people could manage, working calmly on the bottom, while the rest of us would be fighting for air. For a long time, this looked like pure skill and practice. Then researchers examined their bodies and found something inherited. The Bajau tend to have notably larger spleens than their neighbors who do not dive. The spleen acts as a reservoir of oxygen-rich red blood cells, and when a body dives and holds its breath, the spleen contracts and releases that reserve into the bloodstream, extending the time a person can remain underwater. A larger spleen means a larger reserve, and genetic study suggests this is a true evolutionary adaptation favored across generations of a people whose survival depended on the sea. It is evolution observed close to home in living people, shaped by a way of life rather than deep time alone. The next time you hold your breath and feel the urge to surface, consider that somewhere a human body has been quietly tuned, generation by generation, to push that limit further, reshaped by the demands of the sea, into something better suited to the deep. The familiar story has early humans staying put in Africa for ages, before finally cautiously venturing out. The ground keeps disturbing that tidiness. At a site called Dmanisi in the country of Georgia at the edge of Europe, researchers uncovered a remarkable collection of ancient human skulls and bones, dating back around 1.8 million years, far earlier than the neat narrative had allowed for humans so far from Africa. These were early members of our genus, small-brained by our standards with simple tools, and yet they had already traveled an immense distance out of the African homeland and established themselves at the doorstep of Europe. The find quietly rewrote the timetable of our spread across the world, pushing the first great human journeys much earlier than expected. What makes Dmanisi especially striking is the variety among the skulls found together, differing so much from one another that they challenged how we define and separate early human species at all. Rather than a clean sequence of well-behaved types, we found a messy, variable group of real individuals who had wandered far and early. The human urge to move, to push beyond the horizon, turns out to be very old, present in ancestors with brains a fraction the size of ours already, crossing continents long before anyone would have guessed they had the wit or the will to try. Run a finger along the upper curve of your ear, the folded rim near the top, and some people will feel a small thickening or a faint point there slightly toward the back. It has a name Darwin's tubercle noticed and described more than a century ago. In many people, it is smooth and absent. In others, it is a distinct little bump and it does nothing at all. What it seems to be is a remnant. In animals with pointed upright ears, the tip of the ear comes to a genuine point, and that same location on the human ear corresponds to where such a point would sit. The little tubercle some of us carry appears to be the faded trace of that ancestral point, folded down and rounded off, as our ears lost their peak, a small ghost of a sharper ear left stranded on the human rim. It is easy to walk through a whole life never knowing it is there. Yet in that tiny, inconsistent bump present in some people and gone in others, sits a quiet record of a shape our ancestors once had and we mostly gave up. The body is full of these small, unfinished edits, features, half erased and never quite cleaned away, and the top of your own ear may hold one, a barely there point, reaching back toward a creature whose ears stood up and turned toward the world in a way that ours no longer can. We named ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise human, as though wisdom were our private possession, the thing that lifted us above everything else. The deep past does not flatter that name. For most of the time our own species has existed, we were not the only humans with large and capable brains growing our intelligence in splendid isolation. We shared the world with the Neanderthals, whose brains equaled ours, and with the Denisovans and with others, each lineage developing its own capacities, its tools, its ways of surviving in parallel with us. Wisdom, whatever we mean by it, was not handed to one chosen kind of human, while the rest stayed dull. It was emerging across several branches of the family at once, in cousins who made tools and controlled fire and buried their dead, much as we did. The name we gave ourselves quietly implies that we were always the intelligent exception, but the evidence suggests we were one clever human among several distinguished, less by some absolute gift of mind than by the plain fact that we are the branch that happened to survive. It is a more modest self-portrait, and a truer one. We did not earn the title of the wise species by being the only ones capable of thought. We inherited it by outlasting everyone who might have shared it, and then gave the name to ourselves alone, once there was no one left to dispute it. In a cave in what is now Germany, researchers found a slender object that changes how we imagine our ancestors. A flute, carefully carved from the hollow wing bone of a large bird, pierced with finger holes, made roughly 40,000 years ago. It is among the oldest musical instruments ever found. Someone shaped that bone with intent, spacing the holes to produce different notes, crafting a thing whose only purpose was to make music. And where there is a flute, there was almost certainly singing rhythm, perhaps dancing, a whole world of sound that leaves no fossil of its own. Think of the last piece of music that moved you, the way it reached something words could not. A human being was already doing that with breath and a hollow bone, 40,000 years before you were born. Music is not a modern luxury, laid on top of the serious business of survival. It was there deep in the Ice Age among people hunting mammoths and sheltering from bitter winters, who nonetheless found the time and the impulse to make melody. That impulse to shape sound into something beautiful and shared sits very close to the core of what it means to be human, older than farming, older than writing, as old as some of the first modern people in Europe. The bone flute is a small proof that we were never merely surviving. Even then, in the cold and the dark, we made music. Look around a room full of people and count the glasses. Nearsightedness has become so common in some parts of the world that it can seem almost the normal state of the human eye. It is not, and its origin lies in a mismatch. The human eye was shaped over an immense span of time for a life spent largely outdoors, scanning open landscapes, judging distance across a plain, watching for movement far off. That is what it does well. What it was never shaped for is the modern life of close work, of reading and screens, and near focus held for hours a day, especially through the years when the growing eye is most sensitive to how it is used. A large body of research now links the modern surge in nearsightedness to childhood spent indoors, focused on things close at hand, with too little time outside in bright, natural light, while the eye is still developing. The eye that struggles to focus on a distant sign so common now is in part an eye that grew up doing work it was not built for. It is a quiet example of a mismatch between the body we inherited and the world we have made. Our eyes were tuned for the horizon, and we have asked them generation by generation to spend their days looking at things a handspan away, and many of them have quietly changed in response. For a long time it was possible to imagine the Neanderthals and our own ancestors as ships passing in the night, one fading out roughly as the other arrived, never truly sharing the same ground. The genetics closed that comfortable distance. We now know that when modern humans moved into Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals were still there, and the two kinds of human overlapped for thousands of years, long enough to meet, to live near one another, and to have children together. The proof is not a matter of interpretation or a scene painted on a cave wall. It is written into the cells of people alive today, in the Neanderthal DNA that most non-African peoples still carry. Segments that could only have entered our lineage through such meetings. These were not brief or singular encounters, but something that happened enough, across enough time and enough places, to leave a permanent genetic mark on our species. Picture the strangeness of those centuries, two kinds of human sharing a landscape aware of each other, close enough to form families whose descendants would eventually be everyone reading this. Whatever passed between them, curiosity, fear, kinship, we cannot fully know. But it was real, and it was lasting, and you carry the evidence of it inside you, a record of an encounter between your ancestors and a vanished kind of human, sealed into the code of every cell. New parents are often unnerved by it, the soft spot on the top of a baby's head, a place where the skull is not yet closed and you can feel faintly the pulse beneath. It seems like a vulnerability, a piece left unfinished. It is in fact one of the elegant compromises that makes human birth possible at all. A human infant must pass through a birth canal, kept narrow by our upright walking, carrying a head grown large by our expanding brain, and those two demands are in direct conflict. The soft spots, the fontanelles, are part of the resolution. Because the plates of a newborn's skull are not yet fused, they can shift and overlap slightly during birth, letting the head compress just enough to pass through a space that a rigid skull could never manage. After birth, the open spots also allow the skull to keep expanding rapidly to house a brain that grows at a furious pace in the first years of life. So the very thing that alarms a new parent is a clever answer to an ancient problem. The same problem we met earlier, the collision between walking and thinking. That fragile seeming gap on your own head, long since closed, was once what allowed you to be born at all. A small opening, left deliberately unfinished, so that a large mind could enter a world built to make its entry difficult. Among the primates, we are the strange naked one. Our closest relatives wear thick coats of hair, and so presumably did our ancestors, and yet somewhere along the way, our lineage shed most of that covering and became a largely bare-skinned animal. Why remains genuinely unsettled one of the open arguments in the study of our past. The leading idea centers on heat. As our ancestors became active daytime hunters and walkers on the hot African savanna, a coat of fur would have trapped heat dangerously, and bare skin covered in sweat glands allowed the body to cool itself efficiently through evaporation, letting us stay active in conditions that would force a furred animal into the shade. Losing the fur and gaining the ability to sweat may have been part of the same bargain that made us tireless long-distance movers. Other explanations have been offered too, involving parasites or the demands of social signaling, and researchers continue to weigh them because bare skin leaves no fossil, and the timing is hard to pin down. What is clear is that our nakedness is not the default state of a primate, but a real and consequential change, one that reshaped how we cool ourselves, how we move, and eventually how we clothed and decorated the exposed skin we were left with. We are the ape that gave up its coat, and we are still working out exactly what drove us to it. A newborn foal can stand and walk within hours of being born. A human infant months later still cannot lift its own head reliably, cannot move itself, cannot survive for even a day without constant care. By the standards of the animal world, we arrive astonishingly, almost alarmingly helpless. That helplessness is not a flaw, it is a consequence, and in a sense a strategy. Because the human birth canal is narrow, and the human brain is large, our infants must be born early, at a stage when the brain and body are still radically unfinished, essentially completing outside the womb a development that other animals finish inside it. The result is a creature that must be carried, fed, and protected for years, far longer than almost any other. But those years of helplessness are also years of profound learning, a long open window in which the growing brain is shaped by experience, by language, by the constant presence of others. Our extended helplessness buys an extended childhood, and that childhood may be one of the deepest sources of human flexibility and intelligence. What looks like weakness at birth is the near side of a long, formative dependence that helped make us what we are. The years you spent unable to fend for yourself were not merely a vulnerable prelude to real life. They were quietly where a great deal of your humanity was assembled. Not every branch of our family chased the path we took. Some tried a different way of surviving entirely and left their answer written in the bones of the skull. Among our ancient relatives was a group called Paranthropus, and one look at their remains tells you what they lived on. They had enormous jaws, huge, flat, grinding molars, and in some, a bony crest running along the top of the skull to anchor jaw muscles powerful enough to crush the toughest food. This was a human relative built almost entirely around chewing, adapted to survive on hard, fibrous, low-quality plants that other creatures could not process, the coarse roots and tubers and gritty vegetation of a changing landscape. It was a genuine strategy, and for a time it worked. Paranthropus persisted for over 1 million years, a specialist thriving on food nobody else wanted. But specialization is a gamble. As the environment shifted, The very traits that made them masters of tough plants may have left them unable to adapt, and they vanished, while our own more flexible, more generalized ancestors, willing to eat almost anything, carried on. It is a quiet lesson from a lost cousin. There was more than one way to be human, and one of them bet everything on the grinding jaw. We are not descended from that experiment. We are the descendants of the branch that stayed unspecialized, and Paranthropus is the reminder that the road we took was only one of several, and that the others, however well built, could still come to an end. When your skin darkens under a summer sun, you are watching a piece of deep evolutionary history play out in real time. That, tanning, is the body producing more melanin, the pigment that shields the living tissue beneath from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. And the whole story of human skin color is a story of that pigment balanced against sunlight. Across the globe, near the equator, under intense sun, our ancestors evolved darker skin, rich in melanin, to protect against radiation that can damage the body and destroy a vital nutrient in the blood. As populations moved into higher latitudes with weaker sun, that heavy pigment became a liability because some ultraviolet light is needed for the skin to make vitamin D, and so skin grew lighter to let enough of it through. Human skin color, in all its range, is essentially a map of this ancient negotiation between protection and production. Written across the geography our ancestors settled. Your own tan is a small temporary version of the same negotiation, the body reaching for more shielding when the sun grows strong and letting it fade when the light retreats. The color of human skin, so heavy with meaning in human history, is at its root a record of where our ancestors lived and how their bodies learned to bargain with the sun. A bargain your own skin quietly renews every summer without your ever deciding to. We tend to place trade among the achievements of civilization, something that came with cities and markets and coins. The evidence pushes it far deeper into the past. Long before farming, long before any settled town, our ancestors were moving valuable materials across surprising distances. Fine stones suited to making sharp tools and prized pigments like red ochre turn up at ancient sites, many kilometers, sometimes far more from the only places they could have come from. Someone carried them or passed them hand to hand along a chain of exchange across a landscape with no roads and no writing. That movement implies something remarkable about the minds behind it, the ability to value a material, to plan its acquisition, to maintain relationships across distance and perhaps across different groups, to exchange rather than simply take. It suggests networks of connections stretching across the land tens of thousands of years ago, threads of contact and trust binding scattered bands of people together long before anything we would call society. The impulse to trade, to carry something valuable to someone far away and return with something else, sits far back in the human story, older than the plow and the wall and the written word. Our ancestors were building webs of exchange across the wilderness when the whole world was still wilderness, weaving connections between distant people with nothing but their feet, their memory, and the things they thought worth carrying. There is an image almost everyone carries, the famous March of Progress, a line of figures striding from a stooped ape on the left to an upright modern human on the right, each step taller and straighter than the last. It is one of the most misleading pictures ever drawn. Evolution is not a ladder climbing steadily toward us, with each ancestor a rung on the way to the finished product. The honest shape is a bush, densely branched with lineages splitting and spreading in many directions at once, most of them ending in extinction rather than leading anywhere. For long stretches, several human species existed side by side, none of them a step toward the others, each a full and separate branch living its own life. We are not the summit that all of it was climbing toward. We are one surviving twig on a broad, tangled bush, whose other branches, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Paranthropus, and many more, grew, flourished, and were cut short. The march of progress flatters us by placing us at the triumphant end of a straight line. The bush tells a humbler truth, that we are a single accidental survivor among many experiments in being human. Not the goal of the process, but simply the branch that for now has not yet broken off. Seeing our past clearly means giving up the ladder and standing instead in front of that wild, unfinished, mostly broken bush and finding ourselves at the tip of just one living twig. Deep in your neck runs a nerve that takes one of the most absurd routes in the entire human body, and its absurdity is a signature of our distant past. It is called the recurrent laryngeal nerve, and it connects the brain to the larynx, the voice box in your throat. You might expect it to travel the short, direct distance between the two. Instead, it plunges all the way down into the chest, loops beneath a major artery near the heart, and then climbs back up to the throat. It started near a long, unnecessary detour to reach a destination just centimeters from where it began. This makes no sense as a design. It makes perfect sense as inheritance. In fish, the ancestors of this nerve followed a sensible straight path through a body without a distinct neck, running past the gill arches in order. As our lineage evolved, a neck and the heart shifted downward into the chest. The nerve stayed hooked beneath that migrating vessel and was dragged along with it, stretched into the ridiculous loop we carry today. Evolution cannot start over from a clean sheet. It can only modify what already exists. And so an ancient arrangement that once made sense in a fish became across hundreds of millions of years a strange detour in your throat. The nerve that lets you speak reaches its target by way of a path laid down before our ancestors ever left the water, a fossil of the deep past rooted through your own living neck. The control of fire may be the single most transforming thing our ancestors ever achieved, and yet pinning down when it happened is one of the harder problems in the study of our past. At certain ancient sites, researchers have found suggestive traces: burned bone, reddened and heat-altered earth, ash and charcoal, concentrated in ways that hint at controlled fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, in some contested cases far earlier, still long before our own species existed. Fire changes everything for a human. It cooks food, unlocking far more nutrition from meat and roots, and making them easier to chew and digest, which some researchers link to the shrinking of our teeth and jaws and the growth of our energy-hungry brains. It offers warmth, protection from predators in the dark, and a gathering place, a hearth around which the social life of humans could deepen. But the evidence for the earliest fire is difficult to read because natural fires also burn, and telling a deliberately tended hearth from a lightning strike across such deep time is genuinely hard. Researchers still debate exactly when our ancestors first mastered flame rather than merely encountering it. What is not in doubt is that at some point deep in our past, a human kept a fire alive on purpose, and everything after that was different. When you feel drawn to the quiet pull of a flame on a dark evening, you are answering something our ancestors settled around for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals are not simply a chapter that closed. Fragments of them are still at work inside living bodies doing real and specific things. Researchers studying the Neanderthal DNA carried by people today have found that these inherited segments are far from inert. Some influence the immune system, affecting how the body recognizes and fights off certain infections, an inheritance that may have helped our ancestors survive the diseases of the lands the Neanderthals already knew. Some affect the skin and hair and how the body responds to sunlight. Some, in a discovery that surprised many, appear to shape how strongly a person feels pain, so that a particular Neanderthal variant can make its carriers more sensitive to it. This vanished kind of human is not only a memory in the fossil record, but an active presence threaded through the biology of billions of people right now, quietly influencing their health, their defenses, even the intensity of their aches. When someone catches a chill more easily, or feels pain more sharply, or fights off an infection in their own particular way, a Neanderthal gene may be part of the reason. The extinction of the Neanderthals was never total. In the immune cells and nerves and skin of people who will never think of them once they persist, still shaping the daily experience of bodies that carry them without knowing whose inheritance they are living out. We might expect the origin of our own species to be one of the most settled facts in the story, a fixed date we could point to. It keeps moving. For a long time, the oldest widely accepted fossils of anatomically modern humans, our own kind, came in at somewhere under 200,000 years old from East Africa, and the picture seemed reasonably clear. Then at a site in Morocco, on the opposite side of the continent, researchers re-examined and dated fossils to around 300,000 years, far older than expected, and far to the northwest of where we thought our species had emerged. The find pushed the origin of our own kind back by 100,000 years in a single stroke and scattered it across a wider stretch of the continent than the tidy story allowed. It suggests that our species did not appear at one time in one place, but emerged gradually across many regions of Africa from populations that were connected and mixing over a vast landscape. Even the question of when we ourselves began turns out to have no fixed and final answer, only a date that keeps receding as the ground yields more. The origin of the human beings reading and hearing these words is not a settled milestone, but a moving frontier, growing older and more complicated with each unexpected fossil that surfaces from a corner of Africa no one thought to look before. Here is a feature of human life so familiar we rarely think to question it, and yet it is genuinely rare in the natural world. Human women commonly live for decades beyond the age of bearing children, healthy and active, long after reproduction has ended. In most animals, life and fertility fade together, and a long, vigorous life after the childbearing years is unusual enough that its existence in humans demands an explanation. One influential idea is known as the grandmother hypothesis. It proposes that older women no longer bearing their own children greatly increased the survival of their grandchildren by helping to feed, carry, and care for them, freeing their daughters to have more children sooner. In a world without stored food or medicine, an experienced elder who could gather reliably and share knowledge may have tipped the balance between a child living and dying. If so, then natural selection would have quietly favored longer female lifespans, because a grandmother's help translated into more surviving descendants carrying her genes. The idea is debated, and other explanations exist. But the pattern it seeks to explain is real and striking. The long life you may hope to live past middle age is not the default condition of an animal, but possibly a gift shaped by the value of elders to the young. In the deep past, the survival of children may have depended on the presence of grandmothers, and that ancient dependence may be part of why we live as long as we do. Turn your palm up, touch your thumb to your little finger and flex your wrist gently, and a taut band or two may stand up in the middle of your forearm near the wrist. In many people, one of those bands belongs to a muscle called the palmaris longus. In a large number of people, though, that muscle is simply absent from one or both arms, and its absence causes no problem at all, because we no longer really need it. It is a leftover from our deeper primate past. In animals that move through trees, gripping and hanging and swinging from branches, this muscle and others like it played a genuine role in the powerful flexing of the wrist and hand needed to move through the canopy. As our ancestors came down from the trees, and our hands turned toward other work, the muscle lost its importance, and it is now in the slow process of fading out of the species, present in some people and gone in others, with no consequence either way. Surgeons, in fact, sometimes harvest this expendable muscle to repair tendons elsewhere in the body, precisely because losing it costs nothing. Check your own forearm and you may find you are missing a muscle your tree-dwelling ancestors could not have done without a small ongoing edit in the human body, a piece of our arboreal past quietly being written out of us one generation at a time. We have met the Denisovans as a fingertip in a cave, as breath at high altitude, as a genetic ghost across the tropics. Here is one more of their gifts, hidden in the immune system. When our ancestors moved into new lands, they met not only new landscapes, but new diseases, unfamiliar pathogens their bodies had never faced. The Denisovans and Neanderthals, who had lived in those regions for a very long time, had already been shaped by those same diseases. Their immune systems, tuned over many generations to the local threats. When our ancestors interbred with them, they inherited some of that hard-won immune adaptation ready, made a shortcut to defenses that would otherwise have taken ages to evolve. Certain immune system genes carried by living people today, especially variants involved in recognizing and responding to pathogens, trace directly back to these ancient encounters. Denisovan and Neanderthal contributions still standing guard in modern bodies. It is a striking thought that when your immune system springs into action against an infection, part of the machinery it uses may be a gift from a vanished kind of human who survived those same threats long ago. The mingling of our ancestors with these lost cousins was not only a matter of appearance or altitude, but of survival itself, an inheritance of defenses that helped our species take root in a world already full of dangers the locals had learned to meet. We have long told ourselves that art, real symbolic art, was ours alone, the unmistakable signature of the modern human mind. That story has cracked. In several caves in Spain, researchers dated the mineral crusts that had slowly formed over painted marks on the walls. Simple red lines, hand stencils, geometric shapes, and the dates that came back were startling. Older than the time our own species is thought to have arrived in that region. If those dates hold, and they are debated with real vigor, then the only humans present to make those marks were Neanderthals. That possibility strikes at one of our most cherished distinctions. To paint a wall, to make a hand stencil, to place a mark on stone that stands for something beyond itself, has long been treated as proof of a mind like ours and only ours. If the Neanderthals were doing it too in caves in Spain, before we are thought to have set foot there, then the line we drew around our own uniqueness moves or blurs or perhaps disappears. Researchers continue to argue over the dating and what it means, and honest uncertainty remains at the heart of it. But the mere possibility is enough to unsettle us. The first artist may not have been one of our kind at all, but a Neanderthal, pressing a hand to a cave wall in the dark, leaving a mark that would outlast their entire vanished people. A door slams somewhere behind you, and before you can think, your whole body has already responded. The shoulders hunch, the eyes blink shut, the heart lurches, a flood of readiness pours through you in a fraction of a second. You know at once there was no danger. Your body did not wait to find out. This is the startle reflex, one of the fastest and most ancient responses we possess, and it fires long before the thinking part of the brain has any say in the matter. The reaction is wildly out of proportion to a slamming door, and that is precisely the point. It was not tuned for slamming doors. It was tuned for a world in which a sudden sound in the grass or the dark might well be a predator, a snake, a falling rock, something that could kill you in the instant it took to react. In that world, a body that flinched first and questioned later survived, and a body that paused to consider did not. So the reflex was honed to be swift, automatic, and generous with its false alarms, because the cost of one needless flinch was nothing beside the cost of one missed threat. You carry that ancient wiring intact, tuned for dangers your daily life no longer holds. Every time you jump at a harmless noise and feel slightly foolish afterward, you are running a survival program written for ancestors whose sudden sounds were far more likely to mean the difference between living and dying. It is one of the most quoted facts about ourselves, and it still has the power to stop you if you sit with it. We share close to 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees, our nearest living relatives. Nearly the entire genetic instruction set that builds a human is shared with an animal that lives in the forest, uses simple tools, and will never build a city or ask where it came from. The temptation is to conclude that we are therefore almost the same, but that misreads what the number means. That small remaining fraction, a percent or two, is not a trivial rounding error. It is where an enormous amount of the difference lives, including the changes that reshaped our brains, our hands, our capacity for language and culture. A tiny proportion of the code, working through the intricate ways genes switch on and off during development, is enough to separate a creature that paints ceilings and writes symphonies from one that does not. The lesson runs both ways. We are far more closely related to the rest of the living world than we like to imagine, kin to the chimpanzee in almost every letter of our being. And yet within that thin margin of difference sits the whole of what makes us human. Proof that in the deep grammar of life, a very small change worked upon by time can open an astonishing distance between one kind of creature and another. Step into cold water, hold your breath, and submerge your face, and something quietly remarkable happens without any choice on your part. Your heart slows down. This is the mammalian dive reflex, and it is triggered automatically the moment cold water touches your face. While you hold your breath, the heart rate drops. Blood is drawn inward from the limbs toward the vital core, and the body shifts into a state that conserves oxygen, letting you stay under longer and protecting the brain and heart. It is the same reflex that lets seals and dolphins and diving mammals remain submerged for long stretches, and we possess a version of it too, inherited from the deep mammalian past we share with them. Think of the last time you splashed cold water on your face and felt an odd wave of calm. That quieting is the edge of an ancient reflex meant for the water. It reveals how much of our biology reaches back to a shared animal heritage, to a common toolkit of responses distributed across the mammals, present in a seal and present in you. You will likely never need it to survive a dive, and yet it waits in your body, intact. A reflex tuned for water, in a creature that lives on land, another quiet inheritance from ancestors whose world was not quite ours. In the 1920s, a small fossil skull emerged from a limestone quarry in South Africa, the face and brain case of a young child of an ancient human relative. Its features a striking mix of ape and human. The researcher who studied it, Raymond Dart, recognized it as something profoundly important, an early member of the human family, and crucially, one found in Africa. He argued that Africa, not Asia or Europe, was the true cradle of humankind. The world did not want to hear it. At the time, many scholars were convinced our origins lay elsewhere, and the idea that humanity had arisen in Africa met resistance, dismissal, and years of neglect. The little skull set aside while other later discredited fossils held the spotlight. The Taung child, as it came to be known, was right, and its doubters were wrong. Decades of subsequent discovery confirmed beyond doubt that our lineage arose in Africa, and that small skull from a quarry now stands as one of the founding fossils of the entire field. There is a lesson in how long it took to be believed. The truth about where we came from was sitting in a stone box, correctly understood by the man who found it while the world looked away for years. Sometimes the most important evidence about ourselves arrives before we are ready to accept it, and waits patient as stone for us to catch up to what it was telling us all along. We opened this whole exploration at the back of your jaw with the crowded wisdom teeth, and it is worth returning to the deeper cause behind them, because it reaches into nearly every modern mouth. Crowded, crooked teeth, the kind that fill orthodontists' offices, were rare among our ancestors, and remain rare among peoples who still eat a traditional, tough, unprocessed diet. The problem is recent, and it is largely about the jaw, not the teeth. A jawbone grows in response to use, and a childhood spent chewing hard, fibrous, demanding food stimulates the jaw to grow to its full size, wide enough to hold a complete set of teeth in good alignment. Our modern diet, soft-cooked, processed, easy to chew, asks far less of the growing jaw. And so for many people, the jaw grows smaller than it otherwise would, while the teeth arrive at their usual number and size. The result is a mismatch, too many teeth for too little jaw, expressed as crowding impaction, and the near-universal modern need to straighten teeth that a harder diet might have set right on their own. It is a quiet example of how the world we built reshapes the bodies we inherited, sometimes within a single generation. The tough meals our ancestors could not avoid were without anyone intent to have. We met Homo erectus early on, as the great endurer, the human that outlasted us all in sheer span of time. Look closer, and the achievements stack up in a way that should command real respect. Homo erectus was very likely the first of our lineage to master fire, the first to leave Africa and spread across Asia, the maker of increasingly sophisticated tools, a human with a body built much like ours, striding across enormous distances on two long legs. For well over 1 million years, this species persisted and adapted across a vast range of the old world, a genuine success by any measure we might apply. And then it ended, and the ending is strangely obscure to us. We do not fully understand how, or exactly when, the last Homo erectus disappeared, whether they were gradually absorbed, outcompeted, undone by changing climates, or simply faded out region by region over a long, slow twilight. A human that lasted so long, achieved so much, and ranged so widely, slipped out of existence in a way we still cannot clearly trace. There is something sobering in that obscurity. The most enduring human that ever lived did not leave us a clear account of its own end, only the silence after an immensely long presence. We who have existed for so much briefer a time might pause at that, at how completely even the most successful of our relatives can pass from the world and leave the manner of their going a mystery. Before you were born, for a stretch of months in the womb, your entire body was covered in a fine, soft coat of downy hair. It has a name, lanugo, and it grows over nearly the whole developing body. During the middle of pregnancy, then, is usually shed before birth, often swallowed by the fetus and present in the newborn's first waist. Most babies arrive with it already gone, though those born early may still wear it as soft fuzz across the shoulders and back that surprises new parents. This fleeting coat is widely understood as an echo of our furred ancestry, a stage in which the developing human briefly grows the kind of body covering our deep ancestors wore throughout their lives before the human program removes it. Again, in preparation for a life with bare skin. It is one more instance of the body rehearsing its own past during development, growing, and then discarding a feature that belonged to creatures we descend from. You spent part of your time in the womb wearing a coat of fur you would never keep repeating in a few months, a chapter of our history that spanned untold ages, then quietly shedding it before you ever met the open air. The animal we came from is written not only in our fossils and our reflexes, but in the very sequence by which each of us is assembled, briefly furred in the dark, before being born smooth into the light. Here is an idea that turns the usual story of human progress inward. Some researchers propose that over the long span of our species' existence, we underwent a process resembling self-domestication, in effect taming ourselves much as we later tamed dogs and cattle. The argument runs like this: when animals are domesticated, selected over generations for tameness and reduced aggression, they tend to change in a suite of physical ways as well, developing smaller faces, more lightly built skulls, and other softened features, a package of traits seen again and again across domesticated species. Some researchers point out that our own species, compared to earlier humans and to the Neanderthals, shows a similar softening over time, a more lightly built face, a smaller brow, changes that resemble the domestication package. The proposed driver is social. In groups where cooperation mattered and excessive aggression was punished or shunned, the calmer and more cooperative may have thrived and reproduced more gradually, selecting our species toward gentler tempers and the gentler faces that came with them. It remains a hypothesis argued and debated rather than settled, and it is worth holding it as exactly that. but it offers a striking way to see ourselves as a creature that may have been shaped not only by predators and climate, but by one another, our own need to get along quietly, reworking our faces and our natures across the generations until we became, in a sense, our own domesticated animal. Deep in caves across Europe and Indonesia, in chambers that must be reached through darkness and difficulty, our ancestors painted animals on stone tens of thousands of years ago. Horses, bison, lions, wild cattle, rendered with a skill and a charm. Life that can stop you where you stand. Some of these paintings are more than 40,000 years old. What matters most is who made them. The hands that ground the pigments that held the light that laid these creatures onto the rock in the flickering dark belonged to people anatomically identical to you, with the same bodies, the same brains, the same eyes and fingers, separated from us only by time. These were not primitive scrawls, but confident, observed, deeply intentional works, made by artists who understood their subjects and chose how to show them. Standing before such a painting or even a photograph of one, you are looking across an immense stretch of years at the work of a mind you would recognize instantly as human, because it was exactly as human as your own. The impulse to make an image, to capture a living thing on a wall and hold it there, was fully present in people who lived and died in the Ice Age, indistinguishable from us in every physical way. They were us in every sense that anatomy can measure, and the beauty they left in the dark is proof that whatever we are, we were already fully that tens of thousands of years before the first word was ever written down. A tooth looks like a simple, hard object, but it is one of the most detailed records the human body ever produces. A diary written in enamel and dentine that can be read long after everything else is gone. As teeth form in childhood, they grow in fine layers day by day and season by season, and those layers faithfully record the conditions of the life being lived. A serious illness, a period of hunger, a time of stress, even the rhythm of the seasons and the moment of weaning from mother's milk can leave marks in the microscopic structure of a tooth, lines and disruptions frozen into place. Researchers reading ancient teeth can reconstruct astonishing detail about a person who died tens of thousands of years ago, the age at which they were weaned, the illnesses they survived as children, the seasons of scarcity they endured. It is a biography written by the body itself, without intent, in a material tough enough to outlast bone and survive across deep time. Consider that your own teeth carry the same kind of record of your earliest years, the traces of your childhood written quietly into their structure. A private history you cannot read but carry with you. The dead cannot speak of the hardships they lived through, but their teeth can, preserving the illnesses and hungers and seasons of a single human life in a hidden diary that time cannot erase. Of all the questions about our origins, one of the most important is also among the most stubbornly unanswerable. When did humans begin to speak? Language is arguably the single capacity that most shapes human life, the thing that lets us share thought, pass knowledge across generations, build culture and story and lore. And yet we may never know when it began for a simple and frustrating reason. Words leave no fossils. Speech vanishes the instant it is spoken, leaving nothing in the ground for us to date. No artifact, no trace, no layer to excavate. Researchers must reach for indirect clues. The shape of an ancient throat, the size of certain openings in fossil skulls through which nerves once passed. The sophistication of tools and art that might imply the language needed to teach and coordinate them. Each clue is suggestive, and none is conclusive, and estimates for the origin of true language range across an enormous span of time, from a few tens of thousands of years to hundreds of thousands, with no firm agreement among the people who study it. Honest uncertainty sits at the very center of the question. The capacity that most defines us, the flow of words that carries every thought you are following right now, arose at a moment we cannot locate, and in a way we cannot reconstruct, its beginning lost as completely as the first conversation that was ever held and never written down. In 1974, in the dry lands of Ethiopia, researchers uncovered the partial skeleton of a small ancient human relative, a female of a species that lived more than 3 million years ago, and they gave her a name that would become famous: Lucy. What made her extraordinary was how much of her was found enough of the skeleton to see the whole shape of the creature, and what that shape revealed. Lucy stood only about a meter tall, with a brain no larger than a chimpanzee's, and yet her hips, her legs, her knees, the very architecture of her lower body, showed clearly that she walked upright on 2 legs, much as we do. Here was proof in a single remarkable skeleton that our ancestors were striding through the world on 2 feet long before the great expansion of the brain, that walking came first and thinking came after. For decades, Lucy stood as the most complete and iconic ancestor we had found, a small, upright figure who anchored our understanding of how and when we rose onto 2 legs. She was not our direct grandmother in any simple sense, but a member of the wider family from around the crucial time, and her bones spoke with unusual clarity. In Lucy, we can see laid out in a single body the deep truth that the human journey began not with our celebrated minds, but with the humble world-changing act of standing up and walking more than 3 million years before anyone would. Think to wonder how it started. There is a feeling almost everyone knows: the quickening unease. When the lights go out, the sense that the dark is somehow occupied, that something might be there. We tell ourselves it is childish, and in the safety of a modern home it makes no rational sense. It is not childish. It is ancient, and it was once entirely rational. For the vast stretch of our history, night was genuinely dangerous. Our ancestors were vulnerable in the dark, unable to see approaching predators that hunted by night, and the ones who felt a wary alertness after sundown, who stayed close to the fire and startled at movement in the black, were the ones more likely to survive until morning. That vigilance was selected for generation after generation until it became part of the standard human equipment, a low background fear of the dark, wired into us before we were ever born. So the disquiet you feel when you are alone in an unlit house is not a personal flaw or a failure of nerve. It is an inheritance, a faithful old warning system carried down from ancestors, for whom the darkness truly did hold teeth, still firing its gentle alarm in a world where the threat has almost entirely gone. The next time the dark makes you uneasy for no reason, you can understand that you are feeling exactly what kept your ancestors alive, a fear that was for most of human history simply good sense. At the very edge of what we can know about our origins sits a fossil that may reach almost to the beginning. In Chad, in Central Africa, researchers found a remarkably old skull, given the name Sahelanthropus, that may be close to 7 million years old, near the very time our lineage is thought to have split from the ancestors of chimpanzees. If it truly belongs to our side of that split, it would be among the oldest known members of the human family, a glimpse of the deep root from which everything later grew. Certain features, particularly the position where the spine would have entered the skull, hint that this creature may already have held its head in a way consistent with walking upright, astonishingly early if true. But honest caution surrounds it. The fossil is incomplete. Its exact place in the family tree is debated, and researchers continue to argue over whether it is truly one of our ancestors or a related ape from around the same crucial time. That uncertainty is not a weakness of the science, but a mark of how close we are pressing to the very origin where the evidence is thinnest and the questions largest. Near the very beginning of our story stands this battered ancient skull from Chad, possibly a first faint figure in the human line, holding a piece of an answer we are still straining across 7 million years to read. Look at the variety among human beings across the world, and you are looking at a record of adaptation. Each difference, a trace of ancestors meeting the particular demands of a particular place. The ability to digest milk into adulthood arose among peoples who herded animals. Resistance to certain diseases spread where those diseases were common, sometimes at a cost still carried today. The shape of a nose broader or narrower tends to track the climate ancestors. Breathed humid or dry, warm or cold. The nose quietly shaped to condition the air. Skin color maps the intensity of sunlight across latitudes. Body proportions echo the demands of heat and cold. None of these differences run deep enough to divide us into truly separate kinds. For beneath them, we remain a single remarkably similar species, but each is a small inscription, left by the environment, on the bodies of the people who lived in it. The human variety we see is not random, and it is not hierarchical. It is a scattered atlas of survival, a record of our species spreading across an astonishing range of climates and challenges, and adapting in small ways to each. Every population carries the marks of the particular world its ancestors endured, so that the differences among people are less a set of divisions than a shared testament to how widely and how successfully one single kind of human learned to live across the whole face of the earth. Lucy long stood as our iconic ancient ancestor, but an older figure has emerged from the Ethiopian ground to complicate the picture. A skeleton belonging to a species that lived well over 4 million years ago, given the name Ardi. Ardi is older than Lucy by more than 1 million years, and what makes her so revealing is precisely her in-betweenness. She appears to have walked upright when on the ground, yet she retained a foot with a grasping big toe splayed out to the side like a thumb suited for gripping branches, and a body still well adapted to climbing through the trees. Ardi was neither a tree ape nor a fully ground-dwelling walker, but something genuinely transitional, moving upright below and still climbing above, living in both worlds at once. She blurs the tidy line we like to draw around the moment our ancestors became upright walkers, showing instead that the change was gradual, mixed a long overlap in which our ancestors were part walker and part climber for an immense stretch of time. There was no single instant when an ancestor stepped down from the trees and stood up straight forever. There was Ardi, and creatures like her holding both ways, of moving in one body across ages, the transition to walking not a sudden threshold, but a slow blending, in which being human and being upright came into existence a little at a time. We have circled this idea before, and now it is worth naming for what it truly is. Woven into the DNA of living people are stretches of code that come from ancient human populations we have never identified, and may never find groups known to us, only as statistical shadows in the genome ghost lineages, with no name and no to face. In parts of Africa, in the ancestry of Neanderthals, in the tangled record of our species past, geneticists keep detecting these traces segments of DNA, whose pattern reveals interbreeding with populations that branched off long ago and left behind no bones we can hold. They are ghosts in the fullest sense. The data allows real enough to be measured, precise enough to be mapped, yet without any physical remains to give them substance. This ancient inheritance sits inside living bodies at this very moment, fragments of unknown ancestors carried forward by people who will never know they hold them. Populations that vanished so completely they survive only as an echo in the code of their descendants. It is a profound thought to sit with, that some of your own deep ancestry belongs to people we cannot see, cannot name, and know only because a piece of them refused to disappear. The human family reaches back into a darkness we have not fully mapped, and part of what you are made of comes from those shadow ancestors present in you, now speaking through your genome in a language we are only beginning to learn to read. Gather them together, all the small inheritances we have traced through the body, and a single, quiet realization emerges. The flinch at a sudden noise, the goosebumps rising in the cold, the fierce grip of a newborn's hand, the slowing heart in cold water, the fear that stirs in the dark. None of these is random, and none is truly yours alone. Each is a message, carried down across an immense span of time from ancestors who needed it to survive, still delivered faithfully through your living body, long after the need has passed. Your body is in a real sense a place where the vanished still speak. The ancestors who lifted their fur against the cold, who clung to their mother's hair, who froze at a sound in the dark grass, are gone beyond all recovery. And yet their solutions to the problems of staying alive are enacted in you every day, without your knowledge or consent. You did not choose these responses, and you cannot switch them off, because they were written long before you existed into the deep design of what a human is. When you feel any one of them stir, the flinch, the chill, the grip, you are receiving a message from the dead. A survival instruction composed by ancestors you will never see, still being carried out in the quiet machinery of the only body you have ever known. Here is a fact so simple, it is easy to walk past, and so staggering it deserves to stop you. You exist. And for you to exist, every single one of your ancestors, stretching back not merely centuries but millions of years, had to survive at least long enough to reproduce. Not one of them in an unbroken chain reaching back through every ice age, every famine, every plague and predator and catastrophe failed to pass life forward before it ended. Think of what that chain endured. Glaciers advancing across continents, droughts that emptied whole landscapes, the near extinctions when our numbers dwindled to a fragile few, the endless dangers of a world without medicine or shelter or certainty. Through all of it in a line that never once broke, your ancestors lived long enough to hand life to the next link and the next across an almost unimaginable depth of time until the chain reached you. Every person alive is the living end of such a chain, the current tip of an unbroken thread of survival that stretches back beyond our species itself, beyond the first humans into the deep animal past. Whatever else is uncertain about your life, this is not. You are descended without a single failure from an endless line of survivors, and you carry their success inside you as the plain fact of your own existence, the latest in a chain of endurance that has not broken once in millions of 4 years. There is a particular contentment in watching a fire, the way the eyes settle into the moving flame, the way conversation softens and the body eases. Nearly everyone feels it, and it is not an accident of temperament. It is very old. For hundreds of thousands of years since some distant ancestor first learned to keep a flame alive, the fire was the center of human nights, the source of warmth and safety and cooked food, the place where people gathered when the dangerous dark closed in around them. Evening after evening across countless generations, humans sat together at the hearth, and the calm that settles over you before a fire may be the deep trace of that immense habit, a response shaped by all those nights of gathering, in the one circle of light and warmth the darkness could not reach. Some researchers have even found that watching a fire measurably lowers blood pressure, easing the body into exactly the restful state those ancient evenings would have called for. When you feel the quiet pull of a flame and the wish to simply sit and watch it, you are answering something that shaped the nights of your ancestors for longer than our species has fully existed. A nightly gathering at the fire so ancient that the peace it brings is written into you, still drawing you toward the light, in the dark just as it drew them. We have called them lost, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the small-statured people of the islands, and in every visible way they are gone, the last of each kind, dead tens of thousands of years ago. And yet lost is not quite the honest word, because before they disappeared they met our ancestors, and mingled with them and had children whose descendants are alive today. So fragments of these vanished humans were never buried at all. They live on, threaded through the genomes of billions of people, still shaping immune defenses, skin the response to altitude, and cold and pain still doing quiet work in bodies that have no memory of whose inheritance they carry. The Neanderthals persist in the DNA of most people whose roots lie outside Africa. The Denisovans live most strongly in the peoples of New Guinea and the islands nearby. Even the deep, unnamed ghost lineages endure as fragments in the living. Extinction for these cousins was never total, because a species that leaves its code inside another has not entirely ended, only changed the vessel that carries it forward. When we speak of the shadow ancestors we left behind, we should remember that we did not leave all of them behind, that pieces of them came with us, folded into what we are. They are not only in the ground and the museum drawer. They are in the blood, in the cells, in the living bodies of people who descend without knowing it from humans the world otherwise forgot. Think of how we usually picture history as written records, dates, names, the accounts people left of themselves. Now set that beside the true span of the human story and see how thin the written part is. Writing is only a few thousand years old. Everything before it, and that is very nearly the whole of our existence, was never written down at all, and survives only because it left other kinds of marks. It survives in bone, in the fossils that record the shapes of ancestors long gone. It survives in stone, in the tools they struck, and the images they painted, and the ornaments they wore. And it survives in the code we carry, in the DNA that quietly preserves the record of who mingled with whom across the deep past. These are the only archives of almost the entire human journey, silent, partial, and immensely precious, because there is nothing else. No ancestor left a diary of the first fire, the first word, the first burial. Their story reaches us only through what the ground and the body happen to keep. It is worth feeling the weight of that. The realization that nearly everything our kind ever did across millions of years passed without a written trace, remembered only in marrow and rock and the sequences inside our cells. The human story is overwhelmingly an unwritten one, and we are reading it slowly in the only languages the deep past ever left us. We often look outward for mystery toward distant planets and the far reaches of space, and we forget how much unknown territory lies within us in the deep past, written into our own bodies. We have mapped the surfaces of other worlds and charted stars unimaginably far away, and yet the record of our own origins, held in our bones and our genes, remains in many places unread, uncertain, still giving up its secrets a fragment at a time. There are ancestors we have not found, ghost lineages we cannot name, reflexes and structures in our own bodies, whose origins we still debate. The least explored country may not be somewhere out among the stars, but the one sleeping quietly within your own skeleton, the deep history folded into every person, more intimate than any distant world, and in some ways less understood. It is a strange and humbling reversal. We can describe the composition of a star we will never reach, and still argue over when our ancestors first spoke, or why we lost our fur, or who painted the oldest walls. The mystery we most often overlook is the one we carry with us, always. The vast, unexplored past, held in the design of our own bodies, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look inward instead of only up. The nearest unknown country is the one you have been living inside your whole life. Of all the changes across our long history, one may sit closer to the root than any other, and it is not the growth of the brain, but the simple act of standing up. When our distant ancestors rose onto two legs more than 3 million years before the great expansion of the mind, they set in motion a cascade that would touch nearly everything we became. Standing upright freed the hands from the work of walking, and freed hands could carry and gather and eventually make tools and art and everything that flowed from them. It reshaped the pelvis, and in doing so, reshaped human birth into the difficult assisted social event it remains. It changed how we moved across the land, opening the way to the endurance that let us travel and hunt across vast distances. Almost every thread we have followed traces back in some way to that early rising onto 2 feet. We tend to credit the brain with making us human, but the brain came late, built upon a body that had already committed itself to walking upright long before. The truly foundational act was the humblest one, an ancestor standing up and taking weight on 2 legs, and from that single change flowed the hands, the tools, the birth, the journeys, and eventually the mind, nearly the whole of what we would become, unspooling from the quiet decision made, across ages simply to stand. It would be easy to feel the gaps in our story as a kind of loss, all those ancestors never found, all those stretches of DNA we cannot yet interpret, the long silences in the record. But there is another way to hold them. Every gap is a place where something still waits, a fossil not yet lifted from the ground, a lineage not yet named, a piece of code whose meaning we have not yet learned to read. The story of human evolution is not a closed book with missing pages to be mourned. It is an open inquiry, still actively unfolding, still surprising the people who study it, with discoveries that rewrite what we thought we knew. New species have been named in recent years. New ghost lineages keep emerging from the genome. The origin of our own kind keeps growing older as the ground yields more. Far from being finished, our understanding of where we came from is one of the most alive and rapidly changing fields there is. So the unknown parts of our past are not an emptiness, but an invitation held open to anyone who will keep looking, keep digging, keep reading the code more closely. What we do not yet know about ourselves is not a wound. It is a promise that the story is still being written and that the deep past still has a great deal left to tell us whenever we are ready to listen for it. Consider for a moment what you actually are. Not merely a person with a name and a life, but a living archive, a body that carries within it the accumulated solutions of millions of years of survival. The curve of your spine tuned for upright walking. The sweat on your skin cooling a body built to move for hours. The reflexes that flinch and grip and slow your heart older than your species. Some older than fear as we know it. The genes that fight infection, inherited in part from humans who vanished tens of thousands of years ago. You did not assemble any of this. It was handed to you layer upon layer by an unbroken line of ancestors, reaching back beyond the first humans into the deep animal past, each layer a response to some challenge of survival now long gone. You carry all of it at once, an entire history of adaptation, folded quietly into a single living body, most of it working without your notice or thanks. Your body is older than anything you could ever say about it, holding within its design a record deeper than any language could reach. To be alive as a human is to be a walking archive of the deep past. Every reflex and structure, a preserved answer to a question first asked, ages before you were born, carried in you, now quietly keeping you alive. We have spent this whole journey among lost cousins, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, the small island people, Paranthropus and Homo erectus, and the ghost lineages without names. Step back and let the shape of it settle. For nearly all of the human story, our kind was one branch among several, not obviously the destined winner, not the goal of anything, simply one of many experiments in being human, living alongside the others. And then, one by one, every other branch fell silent, until only ours was left. We are not the summit that evolution was climbing toward. We are, as some researchers frame it, the branch that happened to survive the single twig still living on a bush whose other limbs were all cut short. That is a humbler place to stand than the old story allowed, and also a more remarkable one. It means our existence was never guaranteed, never the inevitable outcome, but one possibility among many that came to pass. The others were not failures on the way to us. They were full and separate ways of being human that simply ended. We remain alone now, carrying pieces of them in our cells. The last kind of human left to look back across the whole tangled family and wonder at how many ways there once were to be what we are. Look closely at almost any part of the human body, and you will find not a perfect design but a compromise, a workable answer to competing demands struck and restruck across millions of years. The teeth crowded now into jaws that modern life has left too small once matched a harder diet exactly. The hips, narrowed for upright walking, made birth difficult in order to keep us efficient on two legs. The hands, reshaped for the precise grip that makes tools and threads needles, gave up some of the strength and reach that once served climbing. The throat that lets us speak with such precision left us uniquely able to choke. Everywhere in the body, a gain in one place was paid for by a cost in another. Because evolution does not design from scratch, but only adjusts what already exists, always trading, never perfecting. You are not an optimized machine, but a magnificent set of compromises, each one a bargain your ancestors' bodies struck for the sake of survival carried forward into you. There is a strange beauty in that. The imperfections, the aches, the mismatches, the parts that trouble us, are not flaws in an otherwise perfect design, but the honest signature of a body shaped by real history, by real pressures, real trade-offs, made across an immense stretch of time, every compromise, a small record of what it cost and what it took to become human. We tend to think of ourselves as finished, as the end product, the completed version of the human being. The deep past gently corrects that. Our species is not a destination but a moment, one frame in a sequence still running, and evolution has not stopped simply because we have arrived. The traits still spreading through living populations, the tolerance for milk, the adaptations to altitude and disease, the muscles slowly fading from our arms, are proof that we remain a work in progress, still being shaped, still changing, however slowly. You are not the last word in the human story, but a link in a chain that is still being drawn, receiving an inheritance from everyone who came before, and in your turn passing something forward to whoever comes after. Seeing yourself this way changes something. It places you inside an immense continuity, connected backward to the first upright walker and the first user of fire, and forward to humans not yet born, who will carry pieces of this present into a future we cannot picture. To understand where we came from is to stop seeing yourself as a finished and separate thing, and to feel instead your place in the long, unbroken line, one link among countless others alive at this particular moment, in a story that began before us and will continue long after we are gone. Return one last time to the strangeness we uncovered near the beginning, that for almost all of our history we were not alone. Other humans shared the world with us, and every one of them is gone. It is tempting to read our survival as a kind of triumph, proof that we were meant to endure while they were meant to fade. The honest view is quieter and more sobering. Those other humans were capable, adaptable, in some cases our equals in brain and skill, and they still came to an end. Our own survival was never promised, never earned by some special guarantee, only achieved, moment by moment, generation by generation, until we found ourselves the last kind of human left standing. The extinct cousins who once walked beside us are a reminder of that being the last was not our destiny, but our fortune, that the same forces which erased them could as easily have erased us. It should make us hold our existence a little more carefully, knowing how many other ways of being human have already ended. We are not the inevitable survivors. We are the ones who for now have not yet joined the others in the ground, and the silence where those cousins used to be is a quiet reminder of how contingent and how precious our being here at all truly is. Set aside the fossils and the caves and the deep time, and come all the way back to this present instant, to the body reading or hearing these words. Right now, in this very moment, your cells are carrying out processes refined across 100,000 generations and more, an inheritance of survival so old and so deep that no part of it began with you. Your heart keeps a rhythm older than our species. Your blood defends you with tools partly gifted by vanished cousins. Your reflexes stand ready, with warnings composed before the first human ever spoke. The endurance of every ancestor who ever lived long enough to pass life forward is present in you now, not as a memory or a metaphor, but as the actual living machinery, keeping you alive from one breath to the next. You are the current living edge of an unbroken effort, millions of years long, and that effort does not rest. It is working in you at this very moment quietly, without your attention, as it has worked in every one of your ancestors back through the whole depth of time. To be alive right now is to be the place where all of that endurance arrives and continues the deep past, not behind you but inside you, still doing the oldest work there is, the simple and relentless work of keeping a human alive. We have traveled a long way through lost lineages and vanished cousins through the gaps in our story, and the fragments that survive through the reflexes and the code and the deep unwritten past. And at the end of it, everything returns to something very close and very simple. You. The whole of that immense history is not scattered across distant caves and museum drawers alone. It is gathered, right now, in you. In the quiet, if you let yourself feel it, you hold the entire chain, every ancestor who stood and walked and made fire and clung and survived, every lost cousin whose fragments you carry, every adaptation and reflex and inheritance folded into the body you are living in this moment. An unbroken line of survival reaching back beyond the first humans, beyond all telling, comes to rest here, in a single living person alive now. The shadow ancestors we set out to find were never entirely lost, because the deepest place they survive is not in the ground, but in us, in you, in the quiet endurance that carried an unbroken thread across millions of years to arrive against every odds at this present breath. That is the whole of it. Not a story about the distant dead, but about the living and about the immense, patient, unbroken history you carry within you, quietly, always, even now. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Until next time, good night.